Hey guys, most of us picture medieval bread as something warm, crusty, and almost wholesome in that rustic way. Something peasants broke open at every meal without a second thought. Yet the daily reality of eating bread every single day in medieval Europe was far more layered, and often far harder than that gentle image suggests. For the overwhelming majority of people across the countryside and in the growing towns, bread wasn't just food. It was the fragile thread that held survival together, shaped by soil, season, social rank, and the grinding limits of technology that made every mouthful a quiet negotiation with the past. Where are you watching from tonight? And is there a particular corner of history you'd like us to explore next in this calm, long-form style? If this kind of thoughtful journey into the textures of daily life resonates with you, a quiet like on the video is a gentle way to support more of these deep dives. And if you enjoy sinking into these immersive historical narratives before sleep, consider subscribing so the next one finds its way to you. To understand what it truly meant to eat bread every single day, we have to begin where the bread itself began, in the fields of medieval Europe between roughly the 9th and 15th centuries. Across England, France, the Low Countries, the German lands, and northern Italy, the landscape was dominated by the heavy, open-field system of strip farming. Most peasants, whether free tenants or those bound in some form of serfdom, worked small, scattered plots that rarely exceeded a few acres. Wheat was the aristocrat of grains, prized for its ability to rise into soft, white loaves. But it was expensive to grow and vulnerable to wet summers and harsh winters. Rye, hardier and more forgiving of poor soil, became the everyday staple for millions. Barley and oats filled out the rest, often mixed into coarser breads or porridges when times were tight. A single bad harvest could turn the daily loaf from a comfort into a source of quiet dread. Chroniclers of the period rarely dramatized these shortages the way modern stories might. Instead, they noted them in matter-of-fact entries about rising prices and the thinness of the bread. The soil itself was worked with wooden plows pulled by oxen or, in poorer households, by the family's own strength. Fertilizer came from the dung of the few animals the household could keep, and crop rotation was still finding its rhythm, 2-field or 3-field systems that left half the land fallow each year to recover. In an era before chemical pesticides or selective breeding, weeds, ergot fungus on rye, and rust on wheat were constant companions. A peasant family might spend the entire growing season watching the sky, knowing that the bread they would eat for the next 12 months depended on rains that arrived neither too early nor too late. Once the grain was cut with sickles and threshed on barn floors, it had to be stored carefully. Granaries were raised on staddle stones to keep out rats and damp, yet losses to vermin and mold were simply part of life. The grain that survived was carried, often on the backs of women and children, to the local mill. Hand querns, those small stone grinders turned by muscle alone, were still used in the very poorest or most remote households, producing a coarse, gritty flour that wore teeth down noticeably by middle age. Most villages, however, possessed a watermill or, later, a windmill, both of which were usually owned by the lord of the manor. The miller took a substantial portion of the grain as payment, sometimes as much as 1/16 or more, which added another quiet tax to the daily loaf. What emerged from these mills was rarely the fine, pale flour we associate with modern bread. For the great majority, it was a dark, speckled meal still containing fragments of bran, husk, and the occasional small stone that had slipped through the millstones. Bakers and housewives learned to sift it as best they could with coarse cloths or sieves made of horsehair, but perfection was a luxury. Wealthier households and monastic communities could afford to bolt their flour more thoroughly, producing the prized manchet or wastel bread, soft, white, and shaped into elegant rounds. Everyone else may do with maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, or the heavy horse bread and brown bread that formed the backbone of peasant meals. In some regions, especially in the north and east, rye alone produced the dense, sour loaves that kept for weeks but required strong jaws and slow chewing. The rhythm of baking itself was communal and tightly regulated. Most villages had only one or two ovens, often owned by the lord or the parish, and households brought their shaped dough to be baked in turn. The baker's fee was another slice taken from the loaf, and the law was strict. Short-weight bread or bread sold above the assize price could bring heavy fines. In towns, the guilds watched over the trade with jealous care. Yet even there, the bread that reached the average table was rarely fresh from the oven every morning. Loaves were baked in batches 2 or 3 times a week and then stored on shelves or in cloth bags. By the 3rd or 4th day, they had hardened into something that needed softening in ale, milk, or thin soup before they could be eaten without risking a cracked tooth. For the ordinary man or woman, bread appeared at nearly every meal, breakfast, dinner, and supper, often forming the plate itself. A thick trencher of stale bread would be placed before the eater, and pottage or stew would be ladled onto it. When the meal was finished, the soaked trencher might be eaten, given to the dogs, or saved for the next day. Children learned early that bread was not to be wasted. A crumb on the floor could be a sin in some pious households, or simply an unaffordable loss in others. The taste varied enormously with the season and the year. In a good harvest, the bread might carry a faintly nutty sweetness from the fresh grain. In a lean year, it could be sour, heavy with bran, or faintly musty from damp storage. Salt was expensive, so many everyday loaves were left almost unsalted, relying on the natural fermentation of the sourdough starter, kept alive from batch to batch like a quiet household spirit, to give them character. Yet bread was never merely practical. It carried layers of meaning that wove through daily life in ways that feel distant to us now. In Christian Europe, the loaf sat at the center of the Mass. The priest's elevation of the host transformed the same substance that filled peasant bellies into something sacred. This connection was not lost on ordinary people. When bread failed, when the harvest rotted in the fields or the miller's pond dried up, famine carried a spiritual weight as well as a physical one. Chroniclers sometimes recorded processions of villagers carrying the few remaining loaves to the church, begging for divine intervention. The irony was never far away. The food that symbolized divine provision could also be the source of widespread suffering when nature or human greed interrupted the chain from field to table. Even in times of relative plenty, the labor required to produce that daily bread shaped bodies and schedules. Women rose before dawn to mix the dough by hand in wooden troughs, kneading with arms that grew strong from the repetition. Men carried sacks that could weigh 60 pounds or more. Children gathered firewood or turned the spit that helped heat the oven. The entire household economy revolved around the grain cycle, and when feudal obligations demanded extra days of labor on the lord's domain, those days were taken directly from the time needed to tend one's own strips. A lord's demand for cart service or boon work at harvest could mean the difference between bread that was merely coarse and bread that was dangerously thin. What modern eyes often miss is how thoroughly bread defined social boundaries. At the high table of a noble household, the bread was white, light, and served in generous quantities alongside meats and sauces. In the servants' hall, the same meal might feature a darker loaf, smaller and denser. In the village, status could be read in the color and texture of the bread a family carried home from the oven. The very poorest, those reduced to begging or living on the margins, might receive charity loaves that were little more than baked bran and water. Yet even they were expected to give thanks for it, because the alternative was the slow erosion of strength that came from eating nothing but thin gruel. As the centuries passed, small improvements arrived unevenly. The spread of windmills after the 12th century eased some of the pressure on water-powered sites. New strains of grain and better plows slowly increased yields in favored regions. Urban markets began to offer a wider variety of baked goods, pretzels, enriched breads with eggs or milk for feast days, but these remained occasional treats for most. The daily loaf remained the measure of life. how much you could afford, how good it tasted, how long it lasted, and whether it would see your family through until the next harvest. The story of that loaf, however, is far from finished. For while the fields and mills set the foundation, the true texture of daily bread only reveals itself once the dough is shaped, the oven is fired, and the household gathers around the table. Once the dough was shaped and the oven fired, the household gathered around the table in a ritual that felt as old as the land itself. In the dim light of a rush lamp or the first gray of morning, the wooden trough would be wiped clean, the sourdough starter, passed down through generations like a quiet inheritance, stirred into the flour with warm water drawn from the well. Kneading was no gentle pastime. It demanded the full weight of the body, arms pressing and folding until the mass became smooth and alive under the hands. For a peasant woman managing both field work and hearth, this was the heartbeat of the day, the moment when the grain from her own strips finally took form. Children learned the motion early, their smaller hands helping to shape the smaller loaves reserved for them. In larger manorial households or town bakeries, the process scaled up, with apprentices turning long peels loaded with dough into the brick-lined oven, where the fire had been banked down to a steady, radiant heat that could bake 30 or 40 loaves at once. The smell that filled the air was unmistakable, earthy and slightly sour, laced with the faint char of wood smoke clinging to the oven walls. It drifted beyond the threshold, drawing neighbors or passing laborers who might pause for a moment of shared anticipation. When the loaves finally emerged, their crusts blistered and golden where the grain allowed, they were set on racks to cool just enough to handle. No one waited for them to reach room temperature. In a world without refrigeration or reliable preservation, bread was best eaten while still warm enough to soften the hard edges of daily life. A family might break the first loaf right there, tearing rather than slicing, because knives were for more important tasks and fingers carried no risk of metal splinters. The texture told its own story, dense and chewy in the rye-heavy loaves of the north, lighter and more open where wheat had been generous. A faint grit from the millstones was simply part of the experience, something the tongue learned to ignore the way one ignored the ache of labor-hardened muscles. Around that table, bread became more than sustenance. It structured the meal itself. Breakfast, taken shortly after dawn, often consisted of a thick slice dipped in watered ale or thin milk, perhaps accompanied by a wedge of cheese or a handful of boiled beans if the season permitted. Dinner, the main meal of the day eaten around noon, turned the bread into a plate. A hollowed-out trencher absorbed the juices of pottage, barley thickened with whatever vegetables or scraps of meat the household could spare, until the bread itself grew soft and flavorful. Supper, lighter and taken by firelight, might repeat the pattern with whatever remained, or feature bread soaked in the last of the morning's ale to stretch the stomach's sense of fullness. Waste was unthinkable. Crusts too hard for teeth were soaked again, crumbled into soup, or saved for the pigs that rooted at the edge of the toft. Even the ashes from the oven could be mixed back into the next batch to strengthen the starter, closing the small, self-contained cycle of the hearth. What modern assumptions often overlook is how thoroughly this daily bread revealed the quiet hierarchies of the household and the village. The Lord's table might see 3 or 4 different grades of loaf in a single sitting. The finest manchet for the family, a darker maslin for senior servants, and coarse horse bread for the lower ranks and the hounds. In the village, a prosperous freeholder's wife could afford to sift her flour twice, producing a loaf noticeably lighter and sweeter than her neighbors. The poorest cottagers, scraping a living on marginal land, might stretch their meager grain with ground acorns, vetch, or even dried peas in years of poor harvest, creating a bread that sat heavy in the stomach and offered little nourishment. Yet everyone, from the highest to the lowest, shared the same fundamental truth. Bread was the measure of security. A full granary meant confidence through winter. An empty one meant the slow tightening of belts and the anxious counting of days until spring. The physical toll of this dependence was etched into bodies in ways that skeletal remains still whisper to archaeologists. The constant chewing of coarse, stone-ground bread wore molars down at an astonishing rate. By their 30s, many adults showed the flattened, cupped surfaces that spoke of a lifetime of grit. Dental abscesses were common, and the pain of them, untreated except by herbal rinses or the crude extraction of a neighbor with strong hands, could leave a person unable to eat solid food for weeks. Nutritional deficiencies lurked beneath the surface as well. While bread provided the bulk of calories, it was not perfectly balanced. Rye in particular carried the risk of ergotism, that mysterious affliction when damp grain produced a fungus whose toxins caused convulsions, gangrene, or the terrifying burning sensations known as St. Anthony's fire. Chroniclers sometimes described entire villages limping to the shrine of the saint, loaves held aloft in desperate procession, hoping the holy intercession might cleanse what the miller could not. Even in ordinary times, the bread carried invisible pressures. Feudal custom often required the best grain to be surrendered as rent or tithe before the family kept its share, meaning the loaf on the table was rarely the best the fields could produce. In monastic communities, where bread was both daily fare and spiritual discipline, the rule of Saint Benedict prescribed precise portions, usually a pound of bread per monk per day, but the quality varied with the abbey's lands and the honesty of its millers. Some houses maintained their own bakeries with meticulous care, producing loaves that were the envy of local villagers. Others struggled like any peasant holding when drought struck the domain. Across the board, the calendar of the church shaped consumption as much as the seasons. During Lent, when meat and dairy were set aside, bread took on even greater importance, sometimes enriched with a little oil or herbs on feast days, but more often left plain to remind the faithful of humility. The irony was gentle but persistent. The very substance that sustained the body was also meant to teach the soul about want. As the sun crossed the sky and the year turned, small adaptations emerged to meet the unchanging demand. In the growing towns of Flanders or northern Italy, commercial bakers began to specialize, offering not only the standard household loaf but also enriched breads for festivals, sweetened with honey, studded with raisins when they could be afforded, or shaped into symbolic forms for saints' days. Guild regulations kept prices stable and quality high, yet even here the daily bread of an apprentice or journeyman remained a darker, denser affair than the white rolls served in a merchant's hall. Rural households experimented quietly with whatever nature provided. Chestnuts ground into flour in the upland regions of France, or oats mixed in the cooler, wetter north of England. These variations were not luxuries. They were survival strategies, born of the same practical intelligence that had kept the cycle turning for centuries. The deeper one looked, the more the simple act of eating bread every day revealed the invisible architecture of medieval life. The way land tenure, weather, technology, and belief all converged at the table. A bad harvest in one region could ripple outward, driving up prices in distant markets and forcing even prosperous households to tighten their portions. Lords sometimes responded with mercy, remitting rents or opening granaries, but such gestures were calculated. A starving peasantry could not work the fields or pay future dues. The system was not cruel by design, yet it was unforgiving in its logic. Bread was the currency of survival, and when it failed, the entire social order felt the strain. Still, the story of that daily loaf continued to unfold in quieter, more intimate ways within the walls of the home. For it was there, in the sharing of the trencher and the careful division of the last crust, that bread bound families together more tightly than any charter or sermon ever could. The rhythms of kneading and baking marked the passage of time as surely as the church bells, each loaf a small victory against the uncertainties that lay beyond the village palisade. And as the 14th century drew nearer, those uncertainties were gathering in ways that would test the resilience of that simple loaf more severely than any previous generation had known. The early decades of the 14th century brought a series of wet, cold summers that turned the familiar rhythms of sowing and reaping into something far more precarious. Across northern Europe, from the damp lowlands of Flanders to the open fields of England and the grain belts of France, relentless rain soaked the standing crops until they rotted where they grew. Wheat, already the more delicate of the staples, suffered first. Entire strips that should have yielded golden sheaves produced instead thin, blackened stalks that barely filled a sack. Rye, though hardier, was not immune, and the damp conditions encouraged the spread of ergot in ways that made even the surviving grain treacherous. For the men and women who rose each morning to the same wooden trough and the same sourdough starter, the bread that emerged from the oven began to change in ways that were impossible to ignore. Loaves that had once been merely coarse now carried a faint, bitter edge or crumbled too quickly because the flour itself was weaker, laced with more husk and less gluten. Bakers in the towns stretched what little good grain they had by mixing in beans, acorns, or even sawdust when the miller's price rose beyond reach, and the assize courts struggled to enforce standards that no longer matched the reality of the harvest. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 did not announce itself with sudden catastrophe. It crept in through the steady erosion of the daily loaf. Chroniclers, usually sparing with emotion, noted the rising cost of bread with a kind of weary precision. How a quarter of wheat that once fed a family for months now bought barely enough for a week. In the villages, the careful economy of the trencher became a matter of survival rather than custom. Families who had once set aside the hardest crusts for the animals now soaked every scrap for themselves, and the pottage that soaked into the bread grew thinner, more water than substance. Children learned to chew more slowly, making each mouthful last, while the elderly sometimes gave up their portions entirely so the working adults could keep their strength for the fields. The physical toll deepened. Already worn teeth met flour that was even grittier, and the constant low-level hunger left bodies less able to fight the minor infections that had once been shrugged off. Yet the bread itself remained the anchor. People still gathered at the oven, still carried their dough in linen cloths, still broke the warm loaf with the same quiet ritual, because to abandon that rhythm was to admit that the world had come undone. What made the crisis feel especially intimate was the way it exposed the fragile interdependence between lord and peasant, town and country. Lords who had grown accustomed to receiving their rents in kind now found themselves facing tenants who could barely produce enough to feed themselves, let alone surrender the best grain. Some responded with leniency, remitting portions of the tithe or allowing gleaners to take more than custom permitted. Others tightened their claims, sending bailiffs to seize what little remained in the granaries. In the towns, the guilds watched their bakers' supplies dwindle and issued ordinances against hoarding. Yet bread riots flickered in places like Bruges and Ypres when the price of a loaf outstripped a day's wages. The church, meanwhile, called for processions and special masses. The same loaves that had once symbolized abundance now carried to the altar as offerings of desperation. The irony settled heavily. The food that had for centuries represented divine provision and social order was now the clearest sign that both were under strain. And still the cycle continued. Even in the worst months, the mill wheels turned when there was water enough. The ovens were fired with whatever wood could be gathered, and the dough was kneaded by hands that trembled slightly from hunger but refused to stop. As the famine eased and the rains finally relented, a fragile recovery took hold, only for the mid-century to deliver a blow of a different kind. The arrival of the Black Death in 1347 swept across Europe with a speed and finality that no harvest failure could match. Entire villages lost half or more of their inhabitants in a single season, and the sudden emptiness of the fields changed the meaning of bread almost overnight. With fewer hands to plow and reap, the surviving peasants found themselves working larger holdings. Strips that had once been divided among many now lay open for those who remained, and the balance between wheat and rye began to shift in favor of the more profitable grain. Manorial lords, desperate to keep their domains productive, offered better terms, lower rents, fewer labor services. And some peasants found themselves eating bread that was noticeably lighter and whiter than anything their parents had known. The miller's share, once taken as a heavy tax, was sometimes negotiated downward because there were simply fewer customers. In the towns, where labor shortages drove wages higher, journeymen and their families could afford the occasional enriched loaf or even a bit of fine manchet on a feast day. Yet the change was uneven and carried its own quiet contradictions. In regions hit hardest by plague, abandoned holdings reverted to scrub or were turned over to sheep, reducing the overall acreage under the plow. Grain became relatively plentiful for the survivors, but the knowledge of how quickly abundance could vanish lingered in the collective memory. Older villagers still recounted the famine years to grandchildren who had never known real want, pointing to the bread on the table as something that could never be taken for granted. The texture of daily life around the oven adapted once more. With fewer mouths to feed in many households, the kneading trough grew smaller, and the time saved from field labor allowed some women to experiment with finer sifting or longer fermentation that produced a more open crumb. Sourdough starters, carefully nurtured through the worst of the mortality, now carried the subtle flavors of different grains that had been mixed in desperation and never fully abandoned. The church, facing its own losses among the clergy, emphasized the sacredness of the loaf with renewed intensity, as if reminding the living that survival itself was a form of grace. By the later decades of the 14th century, these shifts had begun to reshape not only the bread but the social landscape that surrounded it. The Statute of Laborers in England and similar attempts elsewhere tried to freeze wages and restore old obligations, yet the reality on the ground was more fluid. A peasant family that had inherited an extra 10 acres after the plague might now grow enough wheat to sell a small surplus at market, using the proceeds to buy salt or iron tools that improved the next year's harvest. Town bakers, responding to a population that was both smaller and slightly more prosperous, began to offer a wider range of loaves, some marked with their guild stamp, others shaped for specific festivals. The daily meal still revolved around the trencher, but the bread beneath the pottage was often firmer, less gritty, and carried a faint sweetness that spoke of better sifting and more consistent fermentation. Even so, the uncertainties that had gathered at the opening of the century had not entirely receded. New outbreaks of plague returned in waves, each one thinning the workforce and reminding people that the fields could empty again with little warning. Climate patterns remained unsettled, with occasional wet summers still capable of spoiling a harvest and driving the price of bread upward in a matter of weeks. The invisible architecture of land, labor, and belief that had sustained the daily loaf for so long was bending under these pressures, and small innovations, better plows in some districts, the slow spread of legumes in crop rotations, were quietly taking root to meet the demand. Within the household, the ritual of baking continued with the same steady hands, the same shared breaking of the warm crust, yet the bread itself now carried the faint imprint of everything the century had endured and everything it had unexpectedly granted. The story of that daily loaf, tested by famine and plague alike, was moving into a new phase as the 15th century approached. Across the countryside and in the towns, the balance between necessity and modest comfort was shifting once more, and the simple act of eating bread every day was beginning to reflect changes that reached far beyond the oven door. As the 15th century unfolded, those changes began to settle into the soil and the daily routines of ordinary people in ways that were both subtle and profound. Population levels, after the sharp declines of the previous century, started a slow and uneven recovery across much of Europe. In England and parts of France, the pressure on land eased for a time, allowing survivors and their descendants to cultivate larger holdings with greater care. The three-field system, already familiar, saw more deliberate use of legumes, peas, beans, and vetches, planted in the fallow periods to restore nitrogen to the earth. This small innovation meant better yields the following year, and the flour that reached the mill carried a richer, more consistent quality. For the peasant family at the kneading trough, the dough rose more reliably, producing loaves that were slightly larger and less prone to the dense heaviness that had marked the leaner decades. The improvements were never dramatic or universal, yet they altered the texture of the daily meal in quiet, accumulative ways. Where once a bad summer could reduce the household to acorn-laced bread within months, many villages now carried a modest surplus from one harvest to the next. Women at the hearth noticed that the flour sifted more cleanly, leaving fewer husks to catch between the teeth, and the sourdough starter, still tended with the same patient reverence, fermented with a steadier vigor. In regions where sheep farming had expanded on former arable land, the manure enriched the strips more generously, coaxing wheat back into fields that had long favored rye. The resulting maslin loaves sat lighter on the stomach, offering a fuller sense of satisfaction even when the pottage poured over the trencher was as simple as ever. Children who helped turn the dough felt the difference in their arms. The mass was more elastic, less stubborn, and the baked crust carried a faint, almost nutty sweetness that had been rare in their grandparents' time in the towns, where markets drew grain from wider catchments. The variety of bread available to the ordinary household expanded in ways that would have seemed luxurious a century earlier. Guild bakers in London or Paris maintained their regulated prices, but the quality of the standard penny loaf crept upward as millers competed for custom. An artisan's family might now expect a loaf that was half wheat and half rye on most days, with the occasional pure wheat roll saved for a saint's day or a visitor. The oven doors in the bakeries opened more frequently, filling narrow streets with that familiar warm, sour scent even on ordinary weekdays. Yet this abundance carried its own quiet irony. The very prosperity that allowed fresher bread also tempted some bakers to cut corners, mixing in cheaper barley or chalk to stretch supplies, prompting civic authorities to appoint inspectors who weighed loaves and tasted samples with the same solemnity once reserved for tithe disputes. The daily loaf remained a public matter, its honesty policed not out of abstract principle, but because the town's stability still rested on full bellies and steady work. Even so, the countryside kept its older rhythms, and the contrast between rural and urban bread grew more noticeable with each passing decade. A peasant woman in the Midlands of England or the Isle de France might still bake twice a week in the shared manorial oven, her loaves darker and denser because the family strips lay farther from the best soil. She would carry them home wrapped in the same linen cloth her mother had used, the crust already firming against the chill air. Supper would see the bread sliced thick and soaked in ale to soften it for the youngest children, whose smaller jaws had not yet adapted to the honest chew of stone-ground grain. In contrast, a craftsman's wife in Ghent or Cologne could step out at midday and return with a warm, gild-stamped loaf that required no softening at all. The difference was not lost on travelers or seasonal laborers who moved between village and town. They spoke of it around evening fires as one of the small compensations of urban life, even while acknowledging that the fields still fed both. The church continued to weave bread into the fabric of belief and charity, but the nature of that connection had softened with the times. Monasteries, many of them recovering their numbers after the plague, maintained their own bakeries with meticulous records of grain received and loaves distributed. The rule still prescribed the daily pound of bread, yet the quality had risen in wealthier houses, where white manchet appeared more often at the abbot's table and the coarser loaves went to the almonry for the poor at the gate. Lay people, too, observed the old customs with renewed confidence. Processions on rogation days carried loaves blessed in the fields, and during harvest festivals the first sheaves were baked into special loaves shared among the reapers. These rituals no longer carried the edge of desperation they had known in the famine years. Instead, they felt like affirmations of a fragile but real stability. The priest's elevation of the host during Mass still transformed the same substance that filled village tables, but now the connection seemed less a plea against want and more a celebration of provision. As the century progressed, new pressures began to test this hard-won balance. In parts of England, lords experimented with enclosing strips of land for pasture, reducing the open fields that had fed generations. Peasants who lost access to their scattered holdings found themselves working as wage laborers on larger domains, their daily bread now purchased rather than grown. The loaf they brought home was often whiter and more uniform, bought from a town baker with coin earned from shearing or carting, yet it carried a different flavor, less tied to their own soil, more dependent on the fluctuations of distant markets. In France, where the long shadow of the 100 Years' War still lingered in ruined villages, reconstruction brought both opportunity and strain. New tenants cleared overgrown plots, replanted with hardier rye, and slowly rebuilt the oven cycles that had fallen silent. The bread that emerged was once again the product of local hands and local weather, but the memory of empty granaries had taught a generation to store more carefully and to diversify their crops against the next unforeseen hardship. By the later decades of the 15th century, these quiet adjustments had created a landscape in which the daily loaf felt both familiar and newly resilient. Windmills dotted more hillsides, easing the burden on water-powered sites and allowing milling even in drier summers. Better roads and river barges carried grain more reliably between regions, smoothing out the worst local shortages that had once turned a single failed harvest into widespread hunger. Within the household, the wooden trough and the peel remained unchanged, but the hands that worked them moved with a touch more assurance. The bread that cooled on the shelf was not always perfect. Grit still found its way into the flour, and a wet autumn could still sour the rye, but it was more often enough and sometimes a little more. Families divided it with the same care, soaked the trenchers with the same pottage, and gave thanks with the same murmured grace. Yet the ritual now held space for small pleasures. A slightly sweeter crust, a loaf that lasted an extra day without hardening, a child's portion that left room for a second helping. The story of that daily bread, shaped by soil and season, by labor and law, by belief and quiet adaptation, was still unfolding as the century drew toward its close. New generations were rising who had never known the worst of the plague years, and the fields they worked were beginning to show the first faint signs of pressures that would test the balance once more. In the towns, the guild ovens hummed with increased activity, while in the villages the shared ovens waited for the next harvest to fill them. The simple act of breaking bread every day continued to mirror the larger currents of the age, revealing in each loaf the enduring interplay of necessity and modest hope. The simple act of breaking bread every day continued to mirror the larger currents of the age, revealing in each loaf the enduring interplay of necessity and modest hope. By the closing decades of the 15th century, the landscape itself bore the marks of these accumulated adjustments. In the open fields of England's Midlands or the fertile plains along the Seine, the strips once worked under strict manorial oversight now showed signs of consolidation. Some families had quietly acquired adjacent holdings through marriage or purchase, allowing them to experiment with more intensive rotations that included a greater share of nitrogen-fixing crops. The flour that reached the household trough carried a deeper color and a more dependable strength, and the dough responded with a livelier rise even in the cooler air of autumn mornings. Women who had learned the craft from mothers who remembered the famine years now taught their daughters a slightly more confident rhythm, kneading with less effort, shaping loaves that held their form better in the peel, and noting with quiet satisfaction how the crust blistered more evenly against the oven bricks. This modest prosperity did not erase the older constraints, but it softened their edges in ways that reshaped daily expectations. In a prosperous yeoman's household in East Anglia, the midday dinner might feature a trencher of mixed wheat and rye that had been bolted once rather than twice, yet still offered a crumb that was neither too dense nor too airy. The pottage ladled over it, thickened with leeks, peas, and the occasional scrap of salted pork, seeped into the bread with a familiar comfort, and the family ate without the anxious calculation that had haunted earlier generations. In the villages of Burgundy or the Rhineland, where wine presses stood alongside granaries, the bread sometimes carried a faint sweetness from the lees of the previous year's vintage mixed sparingly into the starter. These small variations were not recorded in chronicles, Yet they lived on in the memory of taste and texture, passed down as surely as any inheritance of land or tool. The towns, meanwhile, had grown more sophisticated in their management of the loaf. Guild records from places like York or Bruges show bakers maintaining stocks of different grades: household bread for the ordinary customer, manchet for those who could pay a premium, and coarser horse bread, still supplied to the stables of merchants and nobles. The ovens operated on tighter schedules, fired with coal in some forward-looking districts where wood had grown scarce, producing a steadier heat that allowed for more uniform baking. An apprentice turning the peel learned to judge the moment when the crust reached the right shade of deep gold, and the smell that drifted from bakery doors became one of the defining scents of urban life, competing with the tang of tanneries and the smoke of forges. For the journeyman's family living above the shop, the daily bread was no longer a matter of survival alone. It was a small badge of craft and stability, broken at the table with the same deliberate care but now accompanied by a wedge of butter or a spoonful of honey on market days. Even in these more settled times, the bread carried reminders of its deeper vulnerabilities. A poor harvest in one corner of Europe could still send ripples outward through river trade routes, raising prices in distant markets and forcing households to stretch their flour with whatever was cheapest. Lords who had shifted toward cash rents sometimes demanded payment in coin rather than grain, leaving tenants to sell their surplus at whatever price the market allowed, and then buy back bread that might be of lower quality than what they had grown themselves. The irony was gentle but persistent. The very system that had eased some burdens had introduced new dependencies on forces beyond the village boundary. In monastic houses, where the daily ration remained fixed by ancient rule, the abbot's accounts occasionally noted purchases of grain from farther afield to maintain the quality expected by the community, while the almonry loaves distributed to the poor at the gate grew slightly smaller in lean months. The sacred connection between table and altar endured, yet it now rested on a more complex web of commerce and calculation. As the century turned toward its final years, new patterns of land use began to appear more clearly in certain regions. Enclosures for sheep pasture in parts of the English countryside reduced the acreage under the plow, concentrating grain production on the best soils and freeing some laborers to seek work in expanding cloth trades. Those who remained on the land found their daily bread coming from larger, more commercial mills rather than the old manorial ones, and the flour arrived finer, less speckled with bran. The loaves baked at home or in the village oven were noticeably lighter, and children who once struggled with the grit of stone-ground meal now encountered a softer chew that left their teeth less worn by middle age. Yet this shift came at a cost. Families who had lost strips to pasture sometimes found themselves buying bread with wages earned from seasonal labor, and the loaf on the table lost some of the intimate link to their own soil and sweat. In the Low Countries, where dikes and drainage had reclaimed new farmland, the expanded fields supported higher yields of rye and barley, allowing even modest households to keep a larger reserve against winter. The wooden trough in the corner of the cottage saw more frequent use, and the starter was fed with greater care because the family knew it could now sustain them through longer periods of uncertainty. The church, still the quiet regulator of the calendar, continued to mark the year through bread as much as through bells. Harvest Thanksgiving brought the first sheaves to the altar, baked into special loaves that were shared among parishioners after the service. During Advent and Lent the dough was kept plainer, the crust darker, the crumb denser, as a reminder of restraint that no longer carried the edge of desperation but still served its ancient purpose. Pilgrims on the roads to Canterbury or Compostela carried small loaves wrapped in cloth, eating them by the roadside with water from wayside springs, and the act bound them to every other traveler who had done the same for centuries. In the great cathedrals, the host remained the same substance that filled peasant tables, elevated with the same solemn words, yet the contrast between the white wafer and the dark village loaf had grown sharper in the popular imagination. By the 1490s, these accumulated changes had created a world in which the daily bread felt both deeply traditional and quietly transformed. Windmills turned on more hilltops, their sails catching breezes that once went unused, and river barges carried sacks of grain between regions with greater regularity. Within the household the rituals endured unchanged: the warming of the water, the folding of the dough, the careful placement in the oven. But the outcome was more predictable, more generous on most days. The simple act of eating bread every day had become a steadier companion, reflecting not only the soil and the season but the slow, patient adaptations of generations who had learned from famine and plague alike. The trencher still absorbed the pottage, the crust still softened in ale, the last crumbs still gathered with the same reverence. Yet each loaf now carried within it the faint imprint of a Europe that was beginning to look toward new horizons. Those horizons, however, were already stirring with forces that would soon test the balance once more. In the ports of the Atlantic seaboard and the bustling markets of the Mediterranean, merchants spoke of distant lands and new trade routes, and the grain ships that docked in London or Antwerp sometimes carried varieties of wheat unknown to the older fields. Within the villages and towns, the men and women who shaped the dough each morning could not yet see how these distant currents would reshape their own strips and ovens. But the bread they broke at the table remained the quiet measure of everything that had come before and everything that lay ahead. As these distant currents began to touch the shores more frequently toward the turn of the 16th century, the grain ships docking at London, Antwerp, or the quays of Lisbon carried not only familiar Baltic rye but occasional sacks of harder Durham wheat from the Mediterranean or even early cargoes from newly charted Atlantic routes. Merchants spoke in low voices of distant harvests that could supplement local shortfalls, and the flour that reached village mills or urban bakeries sometimes carried a subtly different character, finer in texture, quicker to ferment, yet occasionally prone to a drier crumb when baked. For the woman at the trough in a Sussex cottage or a Flemish farmhouse, the dough she worked by lamplight felt almost the same under her hands, yet she might notice how it absorbed water more readily or rose with a touch more vigor on warm mornings. The loaves that emerged from the oven retained their familiar density, but a sharper eye could detect the faint imprint of wider worlds. A loaf that kept its softness an extra day, or one whose crust took on a deeper hue because the grain had traveled farther and dried more thoroughly en route. These imports were never enough to displace the local harvest. They served instead as a quiet buffer against the old uncertainties. In years when English or French fields suffered late frosts, a shipment of rye from Danzig could steady the price at market and keep the assize loaves from shrinking too noticeably. Bakers in the ports learned to blend the new varieties with their usual stock, producing a maslin that was neither purely local nor entirely foreign but something in between, practical, affordable, and shaped by the same careful hands that had always tended the starter. In the households that could afford it, the trencher at dinner now sometimes carried a flavor note that spoke of distant soils, a mild nuttiness from grain grown under different suns, or a faint mineral edge from millstones that had ground Mediterranean wheat alongside the homegrown sort. Children dipping their portions into pottage tasted the difference without naming it, while elders remarked quietly that bread seemed less likely to mold in the storage chest than it had in their youth. The rhythm of the oven, however, remained anchored in the village and the guild hall. Shared manorial ovens still operated on the old rotation, with each household bringing its shaped loaves wrapped in cloth and waiting its turn by the fire. The miller's toll stayed constant, though larger commercial mills near navigable rivers could now process imported grain more efficiently, turning out a finer bolted flour for those willing to pay the extra fee. In the towns, guild ordinances adapted to the changing supply. Inspectors still weighed the penny loaf and checked for adulteration, but they now also noted whether the bread had been made with foreign wheat, a label that carried neither praise nor blame but simply recorded the new reality of trade. For the ordinary laborer in Bruges or Bristol, the daily purchase from the baker's stall was no longer a simple transaction with the local harvest. It was a small link in a chain that stretched beyond the parish boundary, even if the loaf itself looked and felt much as it always had. Yet these wider connections introduced subtle strains of their own. Grain ships could be delayed by storms or piracy, and when they failed to arrive, The price of bread climbed with a swiftness that reminded everyone how fragile abundance remained. In the countryside, where most still relied on their own strips, the arrival of cheaper imported grain sometimes tempted lords to reduce the acreage under cultivation, converting more land to pasture or leaving strips fallow longer than custom allowed. Families who had grown accustomed to a steadier supply found themselves buying a greater share of their bread with wages earned from weaving or carding, and the loaf on the table lost some of its direct tie to the soil they had walked since childhood. The irony lingered without drama. The very improvements that made bread more reliable for many also made its source less visible, less personal, and therefore more subject to forces no single household could control. Within the home, the old rituals adapted without fanfare. The wooden trough was still scoured after each kneading, the starter still fed with a pinch of the previous batch, and the peels still slid into the oven with the same careful motion. But conversations around the table now occasionally touched on news from the market, how a ship from the Levant had brought wheat that made unusually light manchet, or how a poor vintage in the Baltic had soured the rye and left the bread tasting sharper than usual. Women shared recipes for stretching the dough with mashed roots or a handful of ground chestnuts when prices rose, and children learned to judge a loaf's quality by its weight in the hand rather than its color alone. The physical wear of the bread remained much the same. Teeth still met the occasional grit from the millstones, and jaws still worked the dense crumb that had defined generations. Yet the nutritional edge felt marginally kinder in good years, with fewer households reduced to the thin, bitter loaves that had once marked the worst seasons. The church, ever present in the calendar of the loaf, continued to frame these changes within its ancient patterns. The elevation of the host during Mass still transformed the same substance, whether local rye or blended wheat, into something sacred, and the almonry doors still opened to distribute bread to those who waited in line. Monastic bakeries, many of them now operating with improved accounts and steadier supplies, produced loaves of a consistency that impressed visiting pilgrims. Feast days brought in rich dough flavored with saffron or currants when they could be afforded, small luxuries that marked the turning of the year without erasing the plain bread of ordinary days. Rogation processions wound through the fields as before, loaves held aloft in quiet supplication, though the prayers now carried a note of gratitude for the wider trade that had softened the edge of past famines. As the 16th century opened, these accumulated shifts were creating a Europe in which the daily bread stood at a quiet threshold. Population was rising again in many regions, putting gentle pressure back onto the land and encouraging still more efficient rotations and the occasional use of new tools such as the heavier Dutch plow in low-lying districts. Enclosures continued in pockets of the countryside, concentrating grain production and freeing labor for the growing cloth industry, where wages could buy bread of a quality once reserved for the middling sort. In the Mediterranean ports, the first rumors of entirely new crops from across the ocean, maize for instance, had begun to circulate among merchants, though it would be some time before such things reached the ordinary table. For now, the bread remained resolutely European, shaped by the same hands, baked in the same ovens, and broken with the same measured care that had sustained the continent through centuries of trial and modest gain. The men and women who rose each morning to the familiar scent of fermenting dough could sense, without quite articulating it, that the world around their strips and ovens was broadening. The loaf that cooled on the shelf still anchored the meal, still defined the boundaries of sufficiency and want, yet it now carried within its crumb the faint echo of distant winds and unfamiliar harbors. The cycle of sowing, milling, kneading, and baking continued with the same steady pulse, but the grain itself was no longer entirely of one place. Families divided the bread as they always had, soaked the trenchers in pottage, and gathered the crumbs with the same reverence, unaware that larger transformations, religious, political, and agricultural, were gathering just beyond the horizon. Ready to test once more the resilience of that simple daily loaf, the men and women who rose each morning to the familiar scent of fermenting dough could sense, without quite articulating it, that the world around their strips and ovens was broadening. The loaf that cooled on the shelf still anchored the meal, still defined the boundaries of sufficiency and want, yet it now carried within its crumb the faint echo of distant winds and unfamiliar harbors. The cycle of sowing, milling, kneading, and baking continued with the same steady pulse. But the grain itself was no longer entirely of one place. Families divided the bread as they always had, soaked the trenchers in pottage, and gathered the crumbs with the same reverence, unaware that larger transformations, religious, political, and agricultural, were gathering just beyond the horizon, ready to test once more the resilience of that simple daily loaf. Those transformations announced themselves first through the upheavals of faith that swept across much of northern Europe in the 1530s and 1540s. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII emptied the great bakeries that had once turned out hundreds of loaves each day for monks, servants, and the poor at the gate. The almonry tables fell silent. The steady distribution of charity bread that had softened the sharpest edges of want for generations simply ceased in many parishes. Former monastic lands passed into lay hands, and the new owners often converted arable strips to pasture or leased them to tenants who now paid cash rents rather than delivering grain in kind. For the category who had once received a weekly loaf from the abbey, the daily bread became something purchased rather than given, its price fluctuating with the market instead of the abbot's mercy. In the towns, guild bakers absorbed some of the demand, but the loss of monastic grain reserves meant that even a modest harvest failure could drive the penny loaf beyond the reach of a day laborer's wage within weeks. The physical act of baking itself changed in subtle but telling ways. Where once the monastic oven had operated with clockwork discipline, producing loaves of consistent weight and quality for distribution, the village oven now depended more heavily on whatever grain the local mill could supply. Women who had learned to shape dough under the old rhythm found themselves experimenting with smaller batches, stretching the flour with barley or oats when wheat ran short. The sourdough starter, still nurtured in its crock, took on the flavors of whatever blend arrived from the market. Sometimes a sharper tang from Baltic rye, sometimes a milder note from grain shipped up the Thames. Around the table, the trencher absorbed the same pottage, yet the bread beneath it often felt lighter in the hand, not because the quality had improved, but because the portion had quietly shrunk to match the family's reduced circumstances. Children learned early that the crust must be eaten to the last flake, and elders spoke softly of the old loaves from the abbey days as though recalling a time when bread had carried a different kind of certainty. Across the Channel, in the German lands and the Low Countries, the Reformation brought its own quiet rearrangements. Protestant households kept the daily loaf at the center of the meal, but the calendar of fasts and feasts that had once dictated richer or plainer dough grew less rigid in many places. Lent still arrived, yet the strict prohibition on eggs and dairy in the dough was sometimes observed more in the breach, especially among those who could afford the ingredients. Bakers in reformed cities like Strasbourg or Geneva continued their guild traditions, but the bread they produced now served a community that no longer supported the same network of monastic charity. The result was a modest increase in commercial baking and a corresponding dependence on cash. A weaver's wife in Antwerp might rise before dawn to knead her family's portion, yet she knew that if the next shipment of grain from the Baltic was delayed by contrary winds, the price at the market stall would rise and her children's portions would grow thinner. The irony was not lost on those who lived it. The bread that had once symbolized divine provision within the walls of the church now stood more nakedly as a product of trade and labor alone. Meanwhile, the land itself was shifting under the pressure of a growing population. By the middle decades of the 16th century, numbers were climbing again after the long recovery from the Black Death, and the old open field strips were being asked to feed more mouths than ever before. Enclosure accelerated in parts of England and the Low Countries, with lords and prosperous yeomen hedging off former common lands for sheep or more intensive arable farming. Families who lost access to their scattered holdings found themselves working as wage laborers on consolidated farms. their daily bread bought rather than grown. The loaf they carried home from the baker was often made from grain that had traveled farther and been milled more finely, yet it came at a cost measured not only in coin but in the loss of that intimate connection between field and table. In France, where the wars of religion added their own disruptions, peasants in the war-torn north watched their granaries emptied by soldiers and their ovens stand cold for weeks at a time. When bread returned, it was often made from whatever could be scavenged, mixed grains, ground roots, even the inner bark of trees in the worst seasons, producing a heavy, dark loaf that tested even the strongest jaws. The broader economic currents known later as the price revolution only sharpened these pressures. Silver from the Spanish Americas flowed into European markets, driving inflation that made every commodity dearer, but none more visibly than bread. Chroniclers and town records noted the steady climb in the cost of the standard loaf with a kind of resigned precision. What had once fed a family for a week now stretched to little more than a few days. In London, the size of bread was adjusted repeatedly, yet the penny loaf grew smaller in the hand and coarser in the crumb. Rural households responded by planting more rye and barley, hardier grains that could be coaxed from poorer soil, and the resulting bread carried a darker color and a more pronounced sourness that became the taste of the age for millions. The miller's toll felt heavier when every sack was more expensive, and the baker's fee, once a simple slice taken from the batch, now represented a larger share of the household's slender resources. Still, the daily ritual endured with remarkable tenacity. The wooden trough was scoured each morning, the dough folded under strong arms, the peel slid into the oven with the same practiced motion. Families gathered around the table at the usual hours, breaking the warm loaf and passing the trencher from hand to hand. The pottage might be thinner, the ale weaker, but the bread remained the center, the substance that turned scarcity into something that could be shared and therefore borne. In the growing cities, street vendors sold small rolls or slices to laborers who could not afford a full loaf, and the act of eating became more public, more visible as a marker of one's place in the widening social order. A prosperous merchant's table might still feature fine manchet alongside meats and sauces, while the apprentice in the same household ate darker bread in the kitchen, the contrast as clear as the livery he wore. By the later years of the 16th century, these accumulated strains were producing small but telling adaptations that would shape the next generation's experience of the loaf. In some districts, the introduction of new root crops, turnips, and, in scattered experimental plots, the first potatoes brought back from the Americas began to supplement grain in the pottage, easing the pressure on wheat and rye. The bread itself remained the staple, yet it was now part of a more varied plate, its importance slightly less absolute though no less central. Windmills and watermills operated with greater efficiency, and improved roads allowed grain to move more swiftly from surplus to shortage regions. Within the household, women experimented with longer fermentation times when the flour was coarse, coaxing a lighter crumb from even the humblest blend. The starter crock, passed down through the same careful hands, carried the memory of every harvest and every shortage, its flavor a quiet archive of the century's trials. The men and women who broke that bread each day could not foresee how deeply these changes would be tested in the decades to come. Population continued to press against the land, enclosure gathered pace in certain regions, and the religious and political conflicts that had begun in the Reformation showed no sign of quieting. Yet the loaf on the table, whether dark rye from the village oven or a blended wheat purchased from the town baker, remained the steadfast companion it had always been. It still measured the year's success or failure, still structured the meal and the labor that produced it, still carried within its crumb the lived texture of an age that was moving, slowly and unevenly, toward a different world. The cycle of sowing and reaping, milling and kneading, continued with the same patient rhythm, but the grain that filled the sacks and the dough that rose in the trough now reflected a Europe whose horizons had widened in ways that would soon reshape even the simplest daily loaf once more. The cycle of sowing and reaping, milling and kneading, continued with the same patient rhythm. But the grain that filled the sacks and the dough that rose in the trough now reflected a Europe whose horizons had widened in ways that would soon reshape even the simplest daily loaf once more. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, those wider horizons began to narrow in unexpected ways under the influence of a cooling climate that historians would one day name the Little Ice Age. Summers grew shorter and wetter across much of northern Europe, while winters lengthened and hardened, turning what had once been reliable harvests into uncertain gambles. In the open fields of England, the Low Countries, and northern France, heavy rains lodged the wheat before it could ripen, and early frosts blackened the rye in the ear. The flour that reached the village mill carried more husk and less substance, and the bread baked in shared ovens emerged heavier, darker, and quicker to stale. Families who had grown accustomed to a steadier supply in the later decades of the previous century found themselves measuring portions once again with the old, careful eye, soaking trenchers longer in thinner pottage to extract every last trace of nourishment. The daily experience around the trough adjusted without ceremony but with a quiet tightening of effort. Women rose earlier to work the dough harder, hoping that extended kneading might coax a better rise from the weaker gluten. The sourdough starter, still kept alive in its crock by the hearth, sometimes took on a sharper, almost metallic tang when the grain had suffered damp storage, and the loaves that cooled on the shelf required more ale or milk to soften them for the youngest children. In a yeoman's household in Kent or a tenant farm in Picardy, the midday meal might still feature a Maslin loaf of respectable size, yet the crumb felt denser under the teeth, and the crust cracked rather than blistered. Laborers who now worked for wages on enclosed estates carried smaller loaves wrapped in cloth to the fields, eating them at noon with a wedge of cheese or a handful of onions, aware that the price of bread had risen faster than their pay. The miller's toll, once accepted as part of the natural order, began to feel heavier when every sack represented a larger share of the harvest, and some villages quietly revived the older hand querns for small batches when the Lord's mill stood idle for lack of dry grain. What made these shifts particularly intimate was the way they laid bare the widening gap between the bread of the prosperous and the bread of the many. In the halls of the gentry or the merchant houses of growing cities, white manchets still appeared, often baked from carefully imported or specially sifted wheat, its soft interior a quiet statement of status. At the servant's table or in the laborer's cottage, the loaf remained resolutely dark, rye-heavy, bran-flecked, sometimes mixed with barley or oats to stretch the supply. The contrast was not new, yet it grew more noticeable as population pressed harder against the land and as enclosure turned more strips into pasture. A weaver's family in Norwich might save for a finer loaf on market day, only to find that the baker's price had climbed again because of reports of flooded fields farther north. The act of breaking bread at the table, once a simple affirmation of shared sufficiency, now carried a subtle undercurrent of calculation. How long this loaf would last, whether the next harvest would ease the pressure, and what small economies might be made without letting the children go to bed hungry. Regional variations deepened under these pressures. In the wetter north of England and Scotland, barley and oats played a larger role, producing the dense, flat breads or bannocks that could be baked on hearthstones when the communal oven was too costly to fire. In the sunnier south of France or the Rhineland, wheat held its place longer, and the loaves retained a lighter character even in difficult years. Coastal towns benefited from the occasional arrival of Baltic grain, yet storms could delay shipments for weeks, leaving bakers to stretch supplies with whatever local surpluses remained. The church, though divided by the earlier religious changes, still marked the year with rituals centered on bread. Harvest processions where the first sheaves were carried to the altar, Lenten loaves kept deliberately plain, and charity distributions that had become more sporadic but no less essential. In Catholic regions, the elevation of the host retained its ancient mystery, while in Protestant communities the plain loaf on the communion table served as a different kind of reminder that daily bread was both gift and responsibility. The slow arrival of new crops from across the ocean offered a faint promise of relief, though their integration into the daily loaf was hesitant and uneven. Maize, known in some areas as Indian corn, appeared in scattered fields in Spain and the south of France by the early 17th century, ground into a coarse meal that could supplement rye in times of scarcity. Potatoes, still regarded with suspicion in many northern districts, began to appear in small garden plots in the Low Countries and Ireland, not yet as a staple but as a hearty addition to the pottage that soaked the trencher. Families experimented cautiously. A handful of mashed potato mixed into the dough to make it go further, or maize flour blended with wheat for a sweeter, yellower crumb that some found palatable and others dismissed as fit only for animals. These innovations were practical rather than revolutionary. The bread remained the unquestioned center of the meal, its familiar sour-fermented taste the taste of home even when the grain itself had traveled farther or been stretched with unfamiliar additions. As the century progressed, the pressures on that daily loaf began to spark visible unrest in ways that earlier generations had rarely seen on such a scale. Poor harvests in the 1620s and 1630s, compounded by the disruptions of the 30 Years' War on the continent, sent bread prices soaring in cities from Paris to London. Town records noted the anxious meetings of magistrates who adjusted the assize repeatedly, yet the standard loaf grew smaller and coarser, prompting murmurs that sometimes swelled into riots when the price outstripped a laborer's wage. In the countryside, families who had lost strips to enclosure petitioned or resisted quietly, their daily bread now dependent on wages that bought less and less. The wooden trough and the shared oven continued their work, yet the hands that shaped the dough moved with a new wariness, aware that the loaf on the table had become not only a measure of survival, but a quiet symbol of larger grievances. Even amid these strains, the rhythms of the household endured with remarkable steadiness. Children still learned to knead beside their mothers, their smaller hands pressing into dough that might be grittier than in their grandparents' day. Men returning from the fields or the workshop still broke the warm crust with the same deliberate care, passing portions around the table while the pottage steamed in its pot. The last crumbs were gathered, the trenchers soaked until soft, and the starter fed for the next morning's batch. The physical marks of this dependence remained visible in worn teeth and strong arms, in the slight stoop of those who had carried heavy sacks from mill to hearth for decades. Yet the bread itself continued to offer something more than calories. A sense of continuity, a shared substance that bound the family even when the world beyond the cottage door felt increasingly unstable. By the middle decades of the 17th century, these accumulated experiences were preparing the ground for still deeper changes. Wars and political upheavals continued to disrupt trade routes and harvests, while population growth in certain regions pushed farmers toward more intensive methods and the wider adoption of those New World crops that had once seemed exotic. The loaf that cooled on the shelf each week still anchored the day, yet its story was becoming intertwined with larger currents of commerce, climate, and conflict in ways that would soon alter not only its flavor and texture but the very place it occupied in the lives of ordinary Europeans. The cycle that had sustained the continent for centuries remained unbroken, but the grain within it was beginning to reflect a world that was turning, slowly and sometimes painfully, toward new patterns of production and consumption. The cycle that had sustained the continent for centuries remained unbroken, but the grain within it was beginning to reflect a world that was turning, slowly and sometimes painfully, toward new patterns of production and consumption. By the later decades of the 17th century, those patterns were beginning to crystallize in the fields themselves. In parts of England and the Low Countries, a handful of improving landlords and forward-thinking tenants started to adopt more systematic rotations that moved beyond the old three-field model. Turnips and clover found their way into the fallow strips, restoring the soil while providing winter fodder for livestock whose manure, in turn, enriched the next year's grain. The wheat and rye that reached the mill grew stronger and more consistent, and the flour sifted with fewer husks and a finer texture. For the woman at the trough in a Norfolk cottage or a Flemish tenant farm, The dough responded with a livelier rise and a softer crumb, even when the harvest had been only average. The loaves that cooled on the shelf felt less like a daily gamble and more like the quiet reward of careful husbandry, though the difference was measured in small comforts rather than abundance. These agricultural experiments were never uniform or swift. Most villages still followed the rhythms their grandparents had known, with the same shared oven, the same miller's toll, and the same careful division of the trencher at dinner. Yet word of the new methods spread along drovers' roads and market days, carried by those who had seen heavier yields on neighboring estates. In households where the husband had taken on extra labor to learn the turnip drill or the careful layering of clover, the bread at supper carried a subtle but unmistakable improvement. A loaf that stayed moist longer, a crust that blistered more evenly against the oven bricks, a flavor that lingered with a faint sweetness rather than the accustomed sour bite of leaner grain. Children who helped knead noticed that the dough no longer fought their smaller hands quite so stubbornly, and elders remarked, over the breaking of the warm crust, that the bread seemed to fill the stomach more generously than it once had. The pottage poured over the trencher was still the same simple mixture of leeks, peas, and whatever scraps the household could spare, yet it now soaked into a bread that absorbed the juices more willingly and left less room for the old gnawing hunger. In the growing cities, where population pressed harder against the market stalls, the effects of these changes arrived more unevenly. Guild bakers in London or Amsterdam continued to weigh the standard loaf under the assize, but the grain they received from the countryside was often of better quality, milled finer and blended with greater care. An artisan's family might now expect a Maslin loaf that was noticeably lighter than the heavy rye of their parents' day, purchased with wages that, while still modest, stretched a little farther on market days. The smell drifting from bakery doors remained the same comforting sour warmth, yet it now mingled more often with the scent of enriched dough, occasional additions of milk or butter for those who could afford the small luxury. Even so, the daily bread of the laborer or the street porter stayed darker and denser, a practical necessity rather than a choice, its texture still carrying the honest grit of the millstones and the weight of long hours at the loom or the dock. The contrast between the table of the merchant and the table of the apprentice grew sharper, yet both still revolved around the same central loaf, broken with the same measured care. The wider currents of the age continued to test that loaf in ways both familiar and newly complex. Wars on the continent and naval conflicts disrupted Baltic shipments, sending ripples through the price of rye and forcing bakers to stretch supplies with whatever local grain or root crops could be found. In France, where the burdens of taxation and seigneurial dues weighed heavily on the peasantry, poor harvests in the 1690s brought back memories of earlier scarcities. The bread that emerged from village ovens grew darker and smaller, prompting quiet processions to the parish church where loaves were still offered in supplication. In England, the enclosure movement gathered pace in certain districts, turning open fields into consolidated farms where new rotations could be applied more easily. Families who lost their scattered strips sometimes found themselves buying bread with wages earned from seasonal work on those same improved estates, and the loaf they carried home, though often finer in appearance, carried a different flavor, less tied to their own labor, more dependent on the market and the landlord's decisions. Even amid these pressures, the household rituals adapted with the same patient steadiness that had always defined them. The wooden trough was still scoured after each kneading, the starter still fed from the previous batch, and the peel still slid into the oven with the practiced motion of generations. Women who managed both hearth and garden plot now sometimes added a handful of mashed turnip or the first experimental potatoes to the dough when grain ran short, producing a loaf that was heavier but more filling and less likely to mold in damp storage. Children learned early that the crust must be eaten to the last crumb, yet they also learned that the bread itself was becoming part of a broader plate that included more roots and greens than their grandparents had known. The physical marks of dependence remained, the worn teeth from occasional grit, the strong arms from carrying sacks, but the daily meal now offered a slightly more reliable fullness, a quiet easing of the old uncertainties that had once shadowed every harvest. As the 17th century drew toward its close and the 18th began to unfold, these incremental shifts were laying the groundwork for changes that would reach deeper into the texture of daily life. Agricultural societies in Britain and the Low Countries started to publish pamphlets and conduct trials with new seed varieties and fertilizers, while the slow spread of potatoes from garden plots to field rows promised a hardier supplement that could buffer the grain harvest against the worst of the Little Ice Age's lingering chills. The bread on the table, whether baked in a village oven or purchased from a town baker's stall, remained the unquestioned center of the meal, yet its story was becoming interwoven with larger forces of improvement, commerce and population growth in ways that would soon transform not only its flavor and availability but the very expectations that surrounded it. The cycle of sowing, milling, kneading, and baking continued with the same steady pulse. But the grain that filled the sacks now spoke of a Europe that was beginning to imagine abundance not as a rare gift but as something that careful hands and new knowledge might coax more regularly from the soil. The men and women who broke that bread each day could feel, in small and practical ways, that the world around their strips and ovens was shifting once again. The loaf that cooled on the shelf still anchored the day, still measured sufficiency and want, yet it now carried within its crumb the faint promise of methods that might one day make the daily meal less of a negotiation with fortune and more of a quiet certainty. Families divided it as they always had, soaked the trenchers in pottage, and gathered the crumbs with the same reverence, while beyond the cottage door the fields themselves were beginning to yield to a new rhythm of experimentation and change that would reshape the simple act of eating bread every day in ways no previous century had quite prepared them for. That new rhythm of experimentation and change that would reshape the simple act of eating bread every day in ways no previous century had quite prepared them for took clearer shape in the fields of Britain and the Low Countries as the 18th century unfolded. Improving landlords and their more adventurous tenants began to implement ideas that had once seemed almost eccentric. The systematic sowing of turnips and clover in what had been fallow strips, the careful selection of seed grain from the strongest plants rather than whatever survived the winter, and the use of simple drills that placed seed in straight rows instead of the old broadcast scattering by hand. The wheat that came to the mill in good years was plumper, cleaner, and more consistent, producing flour that sifted with less bran and responded to the kneading trough with a noticeably livelier rise. For the categer's wife in a Yorkshire village or a tenant farmer's household near Rotterdam, the dough she worked by the light of a tallow dip felt different under her palms, more elastic, less stubborn, and the loaves that emerged from the oven carried a finer crumb and a crust that blistered with greater evenness. The daily meal still revolved around the trencher, but the bread beneath the pottage now offered a fuller satisfaction, a quiet sense that the long negotiation with fortune might at last be tilting in the family's favor. These gains were never universal, and the pace of change varied sharply by region and by social rank. In districts where enclosure had consolidated the old open strips into larger, more manageable fields, the new rotations could be applied with greater efficiency, and the resulting surplus grain often found its way to market rather than remaining entirely within the household. Families who had once relied solely on their own harvest now sometimes sold a portion and bought back milled flour of a higher grade, or even purchased ready-baked loaves from the growing number of commercial ovens in nearby market towns. The wooden trough at home might see less frequent use, yet the bread that appeared on the table felt somehow more reliable, less prone to the sudden bitterness or heaviness that had marked leaner harvests in earlier decades. In contrast, those who had lost access to their scattered holdings through enclosure found themselves working as wage laborers on the improved estates, their daily loaf now entirely dependent on coin earned from dawn to dusk labor. The bread they carried home, often a darker maslin still or a plain household loaf from the town baker, might be larger than anything their grandparents had known, but it carried the subtle aftertaste of distance, less intimately tied to the soil they had once walked, more clearly a product of the market and the landlord's decisions. Urban bakers responded to these shifting supplies with quiet professionalism. In the expanding cities of London, Paris, or Amsterdam, guild regulations remained in place, but the volume of grain arriving from the countryside allowed for more frequent firings of the ovens and a wider range of loaves on offer. The standard penny loaf grew slightly larger and lighter in the hand for those who could afford it, while the enriched manchet or wheaten rolls reserved for the middling sort appeared more often on market stalls. The scent that drifted from bakery doors each morning still carried the familiar sour warmth of fermentation, yet it now mingled more frequently with the sweeter notes of milk or butter added to special batches. For the artisan's family living above a workshop or in a narrow court, the daily purchase of bread became less of a careful calculation and more of an expected comfort, though the laborer or the street hawker still made do with coarser fare that required longer soaking in ale to soften it for teeth already worn by years of honest grit. The integration of the potato into garden plots and, increasingly, into field rows added another layer to the story of the daily loaf. What had once been a curious New World import, viewed with suspicion in many northern districts, slowly proved its worth as a hearty companion to grain. Mashed and mixed sparingly into the dough, it helped stretch the wheat or rye when prices climbed, producing a loaf that was heavier but more filling and less likely to mold in damp cellars. Families in Ireland and parts of the Low Countries began to rely on potatoes as a primary staple alongside bread, the two together creating a plate that felt more secure against the old threats of harvest failure. The trencher at dinner might now be smaller, the bread itself sometimes plainer, yet the meal as a whole left the body with a deeper sense of sustenance. Children who helped gather the potatoes from the rows learned early that the bread on the table was no longer the sole measure of survival. It had become part of a quieter partnership with the soil's other gifts. Even so, the promise of improvement carried its own quiet contradictions. Population growth across much of Europe pressed harder against the land, and in years when the weather turned uncooperative, late frosts, prolonged rains, or sudden summer storms, the price of bread could still climb with alarming speed. In France, where taxation and seigneurial obligations remained heavy, the bread riots of the 1770s and 1780s revealed how closely the daily loaf remained tied to public order. Villagers who had tasted the benefits of better rotations watched with unease as merchants hoarded grain or bakers adjusted their loaves downward, and the familiar ritual of breaking bread at the table took on a sharper edge of anxiety. In Britain, the enclosure movement continued its steady advance, bringing greater yields for some, while leaving others more dependent on wages that did not always keep pace with the rising cost of living. The miller's toll and the baker's fee felt more burdensome when every sack of flour represented a larger share of the household budget, and the sourdough starter, still tended with the same patient care, sometimes fermented with a sharper tang born of cheaper, mixed grains. Within the household, however, the old rhythms held with remarkable resilience. The trough was scoured each morning, the dough folded and shaped by hands that had grown strong through repetition, and the peel slid into the oven with the same practiced motion. Families gathered at the usual hours, breaking the warm crust and passing portions around the table while conversation turned quietly to the state of the fields or the latest price at market. The last crumbs were still gathered with care, the trenchers soaked until soft, and the starter fed for the next day's batch. The physical marks of dependence endured, the gradual wearing of teeth, the ache in shoulders from carrying flour sacks. But the daily meal now offered a slightly more generous fullness on most days, a modest buffer against the uncertainties that had once loomed so large. The church, where it retained influence, continued to weave bread into its calendar of feast and fast, though the elevation of the host now stood alongside a more secular awareness that the loaf on the table was shaped as much by human ingenuity as by divine provision. By the closing decades of the 18th century, these accumulated shifts had created a Europe in which the daily bread felt both deeply familiar and quietly transformed. New seed varieties, better drainage, and the wider use of lime and marl as soil amendments were coaxing steadier harvests from lands that had once been marginal. Windmills and watermills turned with greater efficiency, and improved roads and canals carried grain more swiftly from surplus regions to those in need. Within the home, the ritual of baking continued unchanged in its essentials, yet the outcome was more predictable, more generous in good seasons, and the bread itself reflected the slow, patient hand of improvement. The simple act of eating bread every day had become a steadier companion, reflecting not only the soil and the season but the growing belief that careful knowledge and methodical labor might coax a measure of abundance from the earth. The men and women who broke that bread each day could sense, without quite naming it, that the world beyond their cottage doors was accelerating toward something larger. The loaf that cooled on the shelf still anchored the meal, still measured sufficiency and want, yet it now stood at the threshold of changes driven by factories and steam, by growing cities and new political currents that would test the resilience of that daily staple in ways the improving fields could scarcely have foreseen. The cycle of sowing, milling, kneading, and baking continued its ancient pulse, but the grain within it was beginning to reflect a continent on the cusp of transformations that would reach into every hearth and every table. The cycle of sowing, milling, kneading, and baking continued its ancient pulse, but the grain within it was beginning to reflect a continent on the cusp of transformations that would reach into every hearth and every table. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, those transformations arrived most visibly in Britain, where the first steam-powered mills began to hum alongside the older water wheels and windmills. The machinery could grind grain with a speed and fineness that no human or animal-powered quern had ever matched, producing flour so consistently white and light that it seemed almost miraculous to those who carried the sacks home. In the growing industrial towns of Lancashire or the Midlands, commercial bakeries fired their ovens with coal instead of wood, turning out hundreds of uniform loaves each day that reached market stalls still warm from the brick chambers. For the factory worker's wife in Manchester or the dock laborer's family in Liverpool, the daily bread was no longer shaped by her own hands at the wooden trough but purchased from the baker's boy who called at the door, its crust crisp and pale in a way that would have astonished earlier generations accustomed to the speckled darkness of stone-ground rye. The lived texture of that bread shifted in ways both welcome and quietly unsettling. The crumb was softer, the rise higher, and the loaf kept its freshness a little longer in the damp air of back-to-back houses. Yet it lacked the deep, earthy tang that had once marked every mouthful as the direct product of the family's own strips. Many households still kept a small starter alive by the hearth for occasional home baking on Sundays or when wages ran short, but the everyday loaf now carried the faint imprint of distant mills and railway wagons that hauled grain from East Anglia or even imported American wheat as the century progressed. Around the narrow table at dinner, the trencher might be smaller than in rural cottages, the pottage thinner with scraps from the factory canteen, yet the bread itself felt more plentiful, more reliable in good weeks. Children who had never seen a field of waving wheat learned to judge quality by weight and color rather than by the grit between their teeth, and their jaws worked less strenuously on the finer commercial product. The physical wear of centuries, the cupped molars and strong arms, began to ease for some urban families, replaced instead by the subtle fatigue of long shifts at the loom or the forge. These changes spread unevenly across the continent. In France, where the upheavals of revolution and Napoleonic wars had disrupted grain supplies and sent prices soaring, the return of relative peace after 1815 allowed steam mills and improved canals to steady the market once more. Parisian bakers, still bound by guild traditions that lingered in altered form, produced the long loaves and round boules that became emblematic of the city, their crusts crackling with a satisfying snap that town dwellers came to expect as a small daily luxury. In the countryside, however, many peasants continued the older rhythms, firing the shared oven twice a week and soaking trenchers in vegetable broth as their grandparents had done, even while hearing stories of the white bread now common in the capital. The contrast between urban and rural loaves grew sharper, the city dwellers' bread lighter and whiter, the villagers still dense and honest with bran, each carrying its own quiet statement about one's place in the new order. Railways, arriving in the 1830s and 1840s, accelerated the transformation by carrying grain and flour across greater distances with unprecedented speed. A poor harvest in one province no longer meant immediate local famine. Sacks could be rushed from surplus regions or even from overseas, softening the old seasonal dread that had once shadowed every kneading trough. Yet this new reliability came with its own hidden costs. Adulteration scandals began to surface in the growing cities. Flour mixed with alum or ground bones to stretch supplies and brighten the color, prompting public outcry and the first modest regulations on bread quality. Families who bought their daily loaf from the corner bakery learned to inspect it closely, pressing the crust to feel for the right resilience and tasting for any off-note that spoke of shortcuts in the mill or the bakehouse. The trust that had once rested in the familiar face of the village miller or the parish baker now extended to anonymous suppliers whose names appeared only on labels or in newspaper reports. Within the home, the ritual adapted without losing its quiet centrality. Working mothers in the new industrial districts might rise before dawn to set dough for a small batch before leaving for the mill or the workshop, returning in the evening to find the loaves baked by an older child or neighbor. The smell that greeted them remained the same comforting sour warmth, yet it now mingled with the coal smoke of the factory chimneys that hung over every street. Supper still revolved around the broken loaf, the trencher absorbing whatever gravy or broth the household could manage. But conversation around the table increasingly turned to wages, prices, and the latest reports from the corn market. The last crumbs were gathered with the same care, the starter fed for the next morning, and the children sent to bed with the knowledge that bread, though changed in appearance, remained the steadfast measure of whether the week had been kind or cruel. In the countryside, where change arrived more slowly, the older patterns endured with greater tenacity. Enclosed farms applied the new rotations more thoroughly, sending surplus wheat to the railway sidings and receiving back finer flour or even ready-baked goods from distant commercial ovens. Tenant families who had once baked everything themselves now sometimes purchased a portion of their bread, using the saved time for cottage industry or additional field labor. The loaf they carried home from market felt lighter in the hand, its crust more uniform, yet many still preferred the denser, more flavorful bread from their own oven when time and fuel allowed. The physical toll of centuries, the worn teeth, the strong backs, began to ease for some, but others, displaced by enclosure or drawn to the factories, traded the honest ache of the land for the different weariness of the machine age. By the middle decades of the 19th century, these accumulated shifts had created a Europe in which the daily bread stood at a crossroads between tradition and modernity. Steam mills and railways had made white bread more accessible to the urban working class than ever before, yet they had also distanced millions from the soil that produced it. The simple act of eating bread every day, once so intimately bound to the rhythm of the seasons and the labor of one's own hands, now reflected a wider world of commerce, machinery, and social upheaval. Families still broke the loaf with the same measured care, still soaked the trenchers in whatever the pot provided. Yet each mouthful carried the faint echo of distant fields, clattering engines, and the quiet promise or threat of changes still unfolding. The men and women who rose each morning to that bread could sense, in the texture under their fingers and the flavor on their tongues, that the ancient cycle was being rewritten in ways no previous generation had imagined. The loaf on the table remained the anchor of the meal, the quiet measure of sufficiency and want, but its story was now intertwined with the rise of factories and the growth of cities in a manner that would soon test the resilience of that daily staple once more, as new scientific understandings and political movements began to reshape not only how bread was made but who controlled its making. The loaf on the table remained the anchor of the meal, the quiet measure of sufficiency and want. But its story was now intertwined with the rise of factories and the growth of cities in a manner that would soon test the resilience of that daily staple once more, as new scientific understandings and political movements began to reshape not only how bread was made but who controlled its making. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the quiet authority of the village baker and the manorial miller had given way to larger forces. commercial yeast factories producing reliable, fast-acting strains that replaced the old sourdough starters in many urban bakeries, and mechanical mixers that could knead hundreds of pounds of dough in minutes rather than hours. In the industrial districts of Birmingham or Berlin, the bread that arrived at the doorstep each morning was whiter, softer, and more uniform than anything a hand-kneaded loaf had ever achieved. Its pale crumb the visible promise of scientific progress and cheap imported grain from the prairies of North America or the steppes of Russia. For the millworker's family crowded into a tenement flat, this factory bread felt like a small daily victory. Lighter to chew, quicker to soften in thin soup, and less likely to harbor the grit that had once worn down generations of teeth. Yet it carried a subtle distance, its flavor milder and less distinctive, shaped by distant mills and anonymous ovens rather than the familiar rhythm of the household trough. These scientific and commercial shifts arrived alongside rising political awareness among those who baked and those who bought. Bakers' unions in Britain and on the continent began to organize against the long night shifts and the choking coal dust of the bakehouses, demanding shorter hours and better pay in ways that echoed the broader labor movements of the age. The bread they produced remained the same staple, yet the conditions under which it was made became a matter of public debate, with newspapers occasionally reporting on the white slavery of the night bakers or the adulteration scandals that still surfaced when profit pressed too hard against honesty. In the kitchens of the working class, the daily loaf took on an additional layer of meaning. It was no longer simply food but a quiet symbol of the larger struggle for dignity, its price and quality debated around the table alongside wages and rents. Families who could afford it sometimes returned to a small batch of home-baked bread on Sundays, using the old starter kept alive in a crock by the range, its sour tang a deliberate link to older ways even as the weekday loaves came from the commercial cart. The turn of the 20th century brought further refinements that altered the everyday experience in ways both celebrated and quietly mourned. Roller mills, now common in large cities, stripped away more of the bran and germ, producing flour of an almost snowy whiteness that baked into loaves with an open, feathery crumb. Nutritional scientists, studying the newly isolated vitamins, began to warn that this refined bread, while pleasing to the eye and the palate, lacked some of the rough vitality of the older whole-grain varieties, yet their voices were slow to reach the ordinary table. In Paris or Vienna, the long baguette or the crusty Kaiser roll became everyday icons, snapped in half at lunch with a wedge of cheese or a smear of butter, their crisp exterior and soft interior a small sensory pleasure that marked the difference between the old dense Maslin and the new industrial ideal. Rural households, where change moved more slowly, still fired the shared oven with wood or peat and shaped loaves that carried the honest weight of bran and stone dust, their texture a reminder that not every table had been swept into the modern current. War, when it came in 1914, tested the daily bread with a severity that recalled the famines of earlier centuries yet played out on a vastly larger scale. Across Britain, France, and Germany, grain imports faltered under submarine blockade and battlefield disruption, and governments stepped in with rationing systems and official war bread that mixed wheat with barley, potatoes, or even bean flour to stretch supplies. The loaf that reached the table was darker and denser than the pre-war standard, its crust thicker and its crumb heavier, yet families learned to value it with a new intensity, soaking every slice in watery soup or thin gravy to make it last. Children who had grown up on softer factory bread now chewed the honest grit once more, and housewives revived the old skills of the trough, kneading smaller batches by hand when commercial supplies ran short. The irony settled without drama. The bread that symbolized national endurance was once again the product of necessity and communal effort, its flavor sharper and its texture more demanding, yet it sustained millions through years when fields lay fallow or ruined and ovens sometimes stood cold for lack of fuel. The armistice of 1918 brought a tentative return to peacetime plenty in some regions, yet the interwar years revealed how thoroughly the daily loaf had become entangled with larger economic and political currents. In Britain, the return of cheaper imported wheat allowed white bread to reclaim its place on urban tables, while in Germany the hyperinflation of the early 1920s turned the price of a single loaf into a daily crisis that could exhaust a week's wages by afternoon. Families carried paper sacks of banknotes to the baker and watched the loaves shrink or disappear altogether, prompting quiet experiments with substitutes, ground chestnuts, acorns, or even sawdust in the most desperate households. The ritual of breaking bread at the table, once a simple act of shared sufficiency, now carried the weight of anxiety and endurance, its texture and availability a quiet barometer of the nation's fragile recovery. As the 1930s unfolded, new scientific and political forces continued to reshape the loaf in ways that reached directly into the home. Fortification programs began in some countries, adding vitamins and minerals to commercial flour to address the deficiencies that nutritional studies had identified in refined bread. Bakers experimented with sliced loaves wrapped in waxed paper, a convenience that appealed to busy urban households even as traditionalists lamented the loss of the warm, hand-torn crust. In the countryside of France or the Low Countries, many families still preferred their own denser loaves, baked in the old ovens and carrying the faint mineral note of local stone-ground grain. Yet even they felt the pull of the new, cheaper factory yeast, standardized weights, and the occasional railway delivery of finer flour. The physical experience of eating bread every day had grown more varied than ever before. Some tables featured soft, pale slices eaten with margarine and jam, others the heavy, sour rye that required strong jaws and slow chewing. Yet for millions the loaf remained the unchanging center, the substance that turned a thin meal into something that could be shared and therefore borne. By the late 1930s, the gathering clouds of another war were already casting their shadow over the daily bread. Governments stockpiled grain, adjusted milling regulations, and prepared the public for the return of darker, coarser loaves that would sustain the home front once more. The men and women who rose each morning to the familiar scent of baking, whether from their own small oven or the commercial bakery down the street, could sense that the ancient cycle was once again being tested by forces larger than any single harvest or any single hearth. The bread on the table, lighter or darker depending on one's circumstances, still anchored the meal, still measured the day's sufficiency. Yet its story was now part of a wider narrative of industry, science, politics, and conflict that would soon demand new adaptations from every household across the continent. The simple act of eating bread every day, so long the quiet heartbeat of European life, stood ready to meet the demands of a world that was changing faster than ever before, its texture and taste continuing to reflect not only the soil and the season but the larger currents of human ingenuity and hardship that would shape the decades still to come. The simple act of eating bread every day, so long the quiet heartbeat of European life, stood ready to meet the demands of a world that was changing faster than ever before, its texture and taste continuing to reflect not only the soil and the season, but the larger currents of human ingenuity and hardship that would shape the decades still to come. As the shadows of conflict lengthened across the continent in the late 1930s, that readiness would soon be put to one of its sternest tests. When war broke out in 1939, governments moved quickly to secure food supplies, and the daily loaf once again became a matter of national survival. In Britain, unlike meat or sugar, bread itself was never formally rationed during the fighting years. Yet the authorities banned the sale of white bread in 1942 and introduced the national wheatmeal loaf, a darker, coarser bread made with higher extraction flour mixed with potato flour or other extenders to stretch limited wheat supplies. Families who had grown accustomed to the soft, pale factory loaves of the 1930s now carried home these heavier, nuttier slabs, their crusts thicker and their crumb denser, requiring longer chewing and more thorough soaking in thin gravy or vegetable broth to make each slice last through the meal. Housewives revived the older skills of the trough in many kitchens, kneading small batches by hand when commercial supplies ran short, and the familiar sour warmth that filled the air carried a new note of quiet determination. Across the Channel in occupied France, the experience was harsher still. Bread was among the first items rationed in 1940, with strict daily allowances that shrank as the occupation deepened, sometimes to as little as a few hundred grams per person. White baguettes, once the pride of urban bakeries, all but disappeared, replaced by darker loaves bulked out with bran, chestnut flour, potato, or even buckwheat to meet the quotas. The law forbade the sale of fresh bread in some periods, forcing families to eat yesterday's loaves that had hardened overnight, and the ritual of breaking the crust at the table became an exercise in careful division, each member receiving their measured portion before the remainder was wrapped and stored for the next day's thin soup. In Germany and the occupied territories, the situation grew even more precarious. Official rations dropped sharply in the later war years, and the bread that reached urban queues was often heavy with substitutes, sawdust or ground roots in the worst cases, producing loaves that sat like lead in the stomach yet offered the only reliable calories many families could count on. Children learned to chew slowly, making each mouthful count, while elders recalled the denser rye breads of their own youth with a kind of reluctant nostalgia, aware that even those older varieties now seemed almost luxurious by comparison. The physical and emotional texture of the daily meal shifted under these pressures in ways that lingered long after the guns fell silent. In Britain, the end of hostilities in 1945 brought no immediate relief. Poor global harvests and the loss of overseas supplies led to the introduction of bread rationing in 1946, the first time in the country's history, and the national loaf remained the standard fare until 1948. Families queued with their ration books, watching the baker slice the permitted amount with deliberate care, and the loaf that came home felt heavier in the hand than memory suggested, its flavor earthier and more insistent. In France, where rationing continued until 1949, the return of white flour was slow and uneven, and many households clung to the darker wartime blends out of habit or necessity, their trenchers still absorbing whatever pottage the garden or the black market could provide. The simple act of gathering crumbs from the table, once a matter of thrift, now carried the deeper weight of recent hunger, a small ritual of gratitude that bound families more tightly together even as the wider world began its slow reconstruction. As the 1950s unfolded, the gradual lifting of restrictions allowed the daily loaf to reclaim something of its pre-war lightness in many parts of Western Europe. Improved harvests, Marshall Plan aid, and the reopening of trade routes brought finer wheat back to the mills, and commercial bakeries resumed production of the softer, whiter loaves that urban families had come to expect. In Britain, the sliced and wrapped loaf, briefly restricted during the war as an economy measure, returned to supermarket shelves by the early 1950s, offering a convenience that appealed to busy households recovering from years of austerity. The crumb was springy and pale, the crust softer, and the entire loaf stayed fresh longer in its waxed paper, allowing mothers returning from factory shifts or office work to place a ready slice on the table without the old labor of the peel and oven. Yet for many who remembered the wartime national loaf, the new industrial bread carried a subtle blandness, its flavor milder and less distinctive, shaped more by machinery than by the patient hands that had once tended the starter crock. The pace of change accelerated with the arrival of new baking technologies. In Britain, the Chorleywood process, developed in the early 1960s, allowed dough to be mixed at high speed with added fats, extra yeast, and a handful of improvers, producing a loaf that rose quickly, stayed soft for days, and could be made from lower-protein British wheat. Factories adopted it rapidly, and the average British loaf grew 40% softer, cheaper, and longer-lasting, transforming the daily experience for millions. Families in council houses or new estates could now keep a sliced white loaf in the bread bin for nearly a week without it hardening, spreading margarine or jam on uniform slices that required no softening in tea or soup. Similar industrial methods spread across the continent, where long baguettes in France and crusty rolls in Germany and the Low Countries were produced on automated lines that filled bakery windows with uniform perfection. The smell that greeted shoppers each morning remained the comforting warmth of fresh bread, yet it now emanated from larger, more impersonal ovens fed by conveyor belts rather than the peel of the village baker. Even so, the older rhythms refused to disappear entirely. In rural districts of France, Italy, and parts of Germany, many households continued to fire the shared oven once or twice a week, producing denser loaves with the honest tang of stone-ground flour and natural fermentation. City dwellers who could afford it sometimes sought out these traditional breads on market days, carrying home a crusty round whose chew and flavor recalled stories their grandparents had told of pre-war village life. Nutritional scientists, meanwhile, began to voice quiet concerns about the highly refined white bread that now dominated urban tables, noting that the removal of bran and germ had stripped away some of the rough vitality that earlier generations had taken for granted. Fortification programs added vitamins and minerals to commercial flour in several countries. Yet the daily loaf remained, for most people, a practical staple rather than a subject of scientific debate, something broken at the table, soaked in soup or tea, and eaten without ceremony but with the same underlying sense that it anchored the day. By the 1970s and 1980s, the story of that loaf had become one of quiet abundance for many and lingering memory for others. Supermarket chains stocked dozens of varieties: white sliced, brown, wholemeal, seeded, and the sliced loaf in its plastic wrapper had become the default choice for busy families across Western Europe. Children who had never known wartime shortages learned to judge freshness by the softness of the crumb and the absence of mold spots, while older relatives still spoke of the heavier breads of their youth with a mixture of affection and relief. The physical marks of centuries, the worn teeth, the strong arms from kneading, had largely faded from the urban population, replaced by the subtler wear of modern life. Yet the simple act of eating bread every day continued to reflect the era's larger currents: the triumph of convenience and industrial efficiency on one hand, and the quiet persistence of tradition and local taste on the other. The men and women who placed that loaf on the table each evening could sense, in its texture and its availability, that the ancient cycle had been rewritten once more by forces of science, commerce, and recovery. The bread that cooled or stayed soft in its wrapper still anchored the meal, still measured sufficiency in its own quiet way. Yet its story was now part of a wider Europe that was moving toward greater prosperity, greater uniformity, and, in some corners, a growing curiosity about the older, slower ways that had sustained the continent through so many earlier hardships. The cycle of milling and baking, though transformed, continued its patient rhythm, but the grain within it now spoke of a world that was beginning to look back as well as forward, wondering what might be lost as well as gained in the endless pursuit of the perfect daily loaf. The cycle of milling and baking, though transformed, continued its patient rhythm, but the grain within it now spoke of a world that was beginning to look back as well as forward, wondering what might be lost as well as gained in the endless pursuit of the perfect daily loaf. Into the closing decades of the 20th century and beyond, that quiet reflection found voice in small but telling ways. In Britain, France, Germany, and across the Low Countries, a growing interest in artisanal baking revived older methods: stone-ground flours, long-fermented sourdoughs, and loaves shaped by hand rather than machines, sold at farmers' markets and independent bakeries that catered to those who missed the deeper flavor and honest chew of earlier breads. Families who had raised children on soft sliced loaves began to seek out denser rye or wholemeal varieties on weekends, their children tasting for the first time the slight grit and lingering sourness that had once been the ordinary texture of daily life. The wooden trough reappeared in some modern kitchens, not out of necessity but as a deliberate link to the past, while supermarkets stocked both the convenient white slices and the crustier traditional options side by side, letting each household choose its own balance between convenience and character. Yet the deeper story of that daily bread was never only about flavor or technology. Across the centuries, it had been the fragile thread that held survival together, the silent witness to famine and plenty, to plague and recovery, to enclosure and industrial change, to war and peace. From the medieval peasant who watched the sky and felt every raindrop in the coming loaf, to the 19th century factory worker who queued with ration books, to the late 20th century family debating whether to buy the softer factory bread or the denser loaf from the local bakery. The simple act of eating bread every day had revealed the lived texture of European life more clearly than any chronicle or treaty. It had shaped bodies and schedules, defined social boundaries, carried spiritual meaning, and adapted with quiet resilience to every pressure the age could bring. The trencher that once absorbed pottage in a thatched cottage now held supermarket soup in a modern flat. But the ritual of breaking and sharing remained. A small, steady affirmation that some things endure even as the world around them shifts beyond recognition. In the end, what it meant to eat bread every day in medieval Europe, and in all the centuries that followed, was never just about the grain, the mill, or the oven. It was about the patient intelligence of ordinary people who turned the uncertainties of soil and season into something they could share at the table. It was about the contradictions that made the loaf both ordinary and profound. The food that sustained life and yet could so easily fail. The substance that symbolized divine provision and yet exposed every human frailty. The daily necessity that quietly mirrored the larger currents of history. Through wet harvests and dry, through plague and enclosure, through war and industrial transformation, that bread had remained the quiet measure of sufficiency, the shared substance that turned scarcity into something bearable and abundance into something grateful. Today, when we reach for a loaf, whether it is the pale, convenient slice or the crusty, slow-fermented round, we stand at the end of a very long story that began in the open fields and shared ovens of the 9th century. The grain may come from farther away, the dough may rise with scientific precision, yet the act itself still connects us to every man, woman, and child who once rose before dawn to knead, bake, and break the same humble staple. In that continuity lies one of history's gentlest lessons, that the most ordinary things, tended with care across generations, can carry the weight of an entire civilization's hopes, hardships, and quiet triumphs. If this calm journey through the textures of daily life has stayed with you tonight, perhaps you might share in the comments what detail surprised you most, or which corner of the past you would like us to explore next. And if you enjoy sinking into these long, thoughtful historical narratives before sleep, consider subscribing so the next one finds its way quietly to you whenever you need it. Until then, rest well.